This afternoon we're going to talk about campaigning, and we have a fantastic panel of some of Scotland's most active and successful campaigners who are here to talk about campaigning, talk about the best ways to campaign. We'll have a little bit of chat about politics, obviously, but you know, you all work for third sector organisations, so we'll talk about that as well. So on our panel we have Stewart Kirkpatrick at the far end, if you want to give a wave, Stewart. Stewart is head of 38 Degrees in Scotland, and he was head of digital for the Yes Scotland campaign, so I'm sure he's got a huge amount of insight from that. And then we have Richard Dixon, who's Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth Scotland, who's recently come back from 2 weeks in Paris for the big climate change talks, and has obviously a wealth of experience campaigning over the years. And then we have Kat Boyd, who's one of Scotland's youngest and most successful campaigners and up-and-coming campaigners. She recently led the campaign against Rush V, who was the man who was the pro-rape person who was organising a series of events, and that was a very successful 38 Degrees petition and public campaign that led to those events being cancelled. Kat's also running for Rise in the Holyrood election, so she's actually our only Holyrood candidate on the table tonight. Today. And then we have Murray Foote, who is the editor of the Daily Record, who, well, not really a campaigner, but also has had, well, the Daily Record is a voice of campaigners and a campaigning publication. So he can talk a little bit about the role of old media, traditional media, in campaigning in Scotland today, a bit of a contrast to 38 Degrees, for example. So I'm going to start off with just a couple of questions that I've prepared, give people a chance to warm up, and then we'll ask you to put some questions to the panel in a few minutes. So first of all, I think one of the big things, one of the most exciting things that's happened in campaigning over the last few years in Scotland was clearly the referendum campaign. And last year, there was some research came out that suggested that the campaign was as close as it was, that Yes Scotland did as well as it did because of social media and because of the growth of digital media. Stewart, you were head of digital media for Yes Scotland at the time. Why did that happen? How did that happen?
I think it happened for two reasons. One, we invested a lot of time in our social media and our digital strategy in producing interesting content. One of the pitfalls that political campaigns and many other kinds of campaign fall into is they speak language that's of interest only to themselves, and they speak at people. And we made a conscious decision with a lot of what we were doing at Yes Scotland to try and speak with people, to be part of a conversation, but also to grab their interest. And we ran a lot of our content production on lines that would be very familiar to Murray. You know, we had a kind of scrum in the morning of what's interesting today, what we're going to do, what's going to grab people's attention, and then hung it on actions that we would ask people to perform. So that was one part of it, you know, producing content with a purpose, aimed at an audience and conducive to them performing actions. But the other thing was that we encouraged people to have their own voice, so not just share our stuff, retweet our stuff, like our stuff, but actually produce your own material. And we did a lot of work behind the scenes to encourage our supporters to produce content, to have arguments and conversations within their own social spheres, both in real life and on social networks. But we empowered them, and we trained and we instructed. I remember a fantastically empowering moment I had when I missed Andy Murray winning Wimbledon, because I was in a darkened hotel room in Aberdeen with about 25 other people, which sounds a lot more interesting than it was, because I was talking about how to use Snapchat. And these people missed Andy Murray winning Wimbledon because they were so passionate about how can we campaign even more effectively. So we trained and we encouraged people, and we hit the crest of a wave of people wanting to express themselves. So we weren't afraid of people taking the message and crafting it in their image and sharing it with their friends and family in a way they wanted. So we handed power to people who agreed with us and asked them to take that conversation wider. So I think those are the two things that kind of really lit the fuse. And then, after some of the most wonderful moments for me in the Yes campaign were where enormous digital media things happened and I knew nothing about them because they were spontaneous and people had just decided, we'll use this hashtag today, and it had gone viral. And that was a tremendous moment. So
I think not many people would argue that the Cybernats won the online campaign, didn't they?
No. That's nothing to do with our campaign, thank you.
However, a lot of people would say that the defining moment in the referendum campaign was actually the vow, which was released on the front page of the Daily Record as an exclusive. And I know that Murray had quite a hand in the creation of that story. Some people would argue that that's what swung it in the end, the vow. Obviously, we'll never really know. What's your take on that, Murray?
There's been countless conversations and countless column inches devoted to the vow, why it came about. Very, very briefly, I'll take you back to the weekend of the 7th of September. The Sunday Times poll came out that put the yes side ahead by 2 points, 51 to 49. I'd been in Dundee for a family party, woke up on Sunday morning nursing a hangover from hell, and watched Sky News where a parade of politicians from the unionist side came on and started speaking about extra powers. And it was so incoherent and it was so rambling that I sort of, through my sort of hangover, I got angry. Drove back to, well, I didn't actually drive, my wife did. Drove back to Glasgow, went in the office, wrote a leader, turned the three leaders into the Blythe Monkeys, which was sort of got their attention, but also became a bit of a difficulty to get them to discuss putting a vow in the paper because I'd made them monkeys. That's a completely different conversation. After that, it was the Monday morning after we published that the See No Devo, Hear No Devo front page, that I spoke to the staff in the office who were probably more pro-yes than no. Hard to believe, perhaps, for you out there, that the Daily Record staff were more pro-independence than unionist. But I asked every single one of them if they believed what they were hearing from the unionist parties on this timetable to further powers and the incoherence. Every one of them said no. So what do we do to basically nail their colours to a mast so that we can use this in the future? I contacted Gordon Brown. I knew that Gordon Brown was discussing tactics, if you like, with the Prime Minister. I asked him if he would create or get the three leaders to sign, one of them whom were going to be the future Prime Minister, to sign a promise that basically said that we're going to deliver on the promise that we're making here. That's how the vow came about. Do I believe it had a substantial effect on the outcome? No, I don't. I think no one was more surprised when Alex Salmond blamed the vow for him losing the referendum than I was. There is no evidence to suggest it did make a substantial change to voting intentions. I think it did change the narrative. It probably took a bit of steam out of the SNP bandwagon at that time. But did it change many votes? I doubt it. I really haven't seen any empirical evidence from studies that suggest it did. But what it has done is given the current Scottish Government a battering ram with the current Prime Minister. And whether they secure the deal in a fiscal framework that they hope to deliver, time will tell. But I kind of think that the vow is doing what it was designed to do when it was published.
Brilliant. And given both of those answers, maybe we can ask Kat and Richard what they think people during the Holyrood election can learn from this. Is it digital? Is it old media? Where should people be working?
Well, firstly, I think that, those two questions put together shows that the popular print media still has a particular resonance, which despite social media and social media campaigning isn't going away anytime soon. Actually, I might even go as far to say that the vow on that front page might be one of the most important things post-referendum. I actually agree with what Murray said, because actually it doesn't matter how many voters it swung at the time. I think it was probably quite not very many to be honest, it conditioned the expectations of both yes voters and no voters that the unionist offer was in a sense the best of both worlds. And I think that if the current fiscal framework talks falter, which seems, you know, a serious possibility, then that's going to be perceived as Westminster's fault. I mean, now you've got Labour, who've publicly parted from their Better Together bedfellows and the Tories. They've backed Sturgeon in the negotiations. And if the Scotland Act fails, then we're going to be in very, very interesting political territory, because you'll have half of Scotland, well, nearly half of Scotland wanting independence, a divided unionist side unable to agree what Devo Max looks like. For me, I think that makes second referendum much, much more likely. So I suppose the ultimate final legacy of the vows yet to be written, but it's definitely one of probably the most significant things post-independence, because it gave a benchmark of what more powers might look like, and it conditioned people's expectations in that regard. I mean, in terms of the coming election in May, look, social media is a key tool for political campaigning. I think there's no doubt about that. And there is something in politics. I mean, when we did Radical Independence, the most successful thing that we did were mass canvassing events. We went out into our own communities, we organised them like mobilisations. It felt like you were on a demonstration when you went to those events, not just knocking doors. You know, we'd meet up in a car park or, you know, in front of a supermarket locally, and we'd go knock people's doors and have a one-to-one interaction with them. That matters, but it's undeniable at the same time as that social media was important. And I think that, like, coming up to the Holyrood elections, there's sort of two areas that make these things interesting. The first one is a kind of, like a kind of political picture that during the referendum, like, I mean, it's undeniable that Scottish politics has changed. I mean, you know, you look at the results of the general election, it's undeniable that things have changed. You know, there's new political parties like Rise have emerged, and there's this, there's an opening for the debate and that sort of flourishing of democracy we saw during the referendum to continue. I mean, my big worry about politics in Scotland is that we're going to end up back with the same old Labour versus SNP tribalism, and that's what always turned me off party politics. So, you know, with that kind of little gap that's opening, small groups like Rise have a chance, and for small parties like us or the Greens, social media is massively important, but it's only in the same kind of small opening that is replicated politically. And what I mean by that is that this is as true for any radical left ideas that have emerged over the last 2 years. You know, it's true for Rise, it's true for Jeremy Corbyn winning the Labour leadership, it's true for Bernie Sanders, it's true for Podemos in Spain, and that's that social media is an accessible, free and somewhat democratic platform for ideas that are seen traditionally as outside the mainstream. You know, and what we all have in common, you're like me and Corbyn and Sanders, all these groups and ideas, what we have in common is that those radical left-wing ideas don't have big business backers. You know, we're traditionally pretty skint, I'll be honest. There's only so many whip rounds and buckets you can do to fund your campaign. So social media is a big platform for small organisations like us, but the window of opportunity for that is still quite small, because there's a growing corporatisation of social media that's happening. I'll give you an example of this. During the general election, the Tories spent £100,000 a month on Facebook alone. Like, that's a staggering amount of money. So as those platforms become more commercialised, the political debate in those spaces is also shut down. Yeah. So these two little cracks together do offer opportunities, but we'll see what happens.
So Richard, picking up on something that Kat was saying there about face-to-face interactions and people coming together in a group, December last year you were in Paris, which saw the for the UN Climate Conference, which was the end of years of campaigning for new global international climate change targets. It came shortly after the terrorist attacks in Paris, and as a result the demonstrations were cancelled. I wonder how much that had an impact on the outcome, and really what you're feeling about the need for public campaigning to get out in the streets is these days.
So I think the politicians will always tell you that it doesn't make any difference how many people turn out on the streets, but the evidence is always the opposite. So we were talking to our French Friends of the Earth group, who were part of the coalition that were negotiating with the French government. So Laurent Fabius was the foreign minister. He was the chair of the climate conference, but he was also dealing with the terrorist attacks and with the security situation in Paris. And they had several meetings with him after the Paris attacks about what could and couldn't happen in the streets. And so, of course, it started with martial law, nothing at all can happen, not more than 3 people can get together anywhere. So the hundreds of thousands of people who were going to come in the first weekend and then the last weekend, and a smaller group in the middle weekend, all of that was completely off, apparently. But Fabius let slip that actually he was quite glad that the last weekend wasn't happening, because he didn't really like the political message that the 100,000 or so people who were going to come then were bringing. So it was pretty obvious from that conversation he was feeling the pressure that if those people came and their message was going to be, well, you've got a deal, but it's not a deal that's going to save the poor, it's not a deal which is actually going to reduce emissions as quickly as you say it will and as the planet needs, he didn't want to hear that message, and he didn't want hundreds of thousands of people on the streets saying that. So in the end, it led to some really interesting innovation. So you may have seen pictures on the first weekend of Place de la République covered in pairs of shoes. So groups were not allowed to bring lots of people, but they brought lots of shoes to show that these were shoes of the people who would have been there. So that was really clever. And by the end, the restrictions were lifting. So actually at the last weekend, so talks is supposed to finish on the last Friday of the 2 weeks. Of course, they never do. So on the Saturday, the talks were still going on, coming to something of a conclusion. But there were demonstrations on the streets. So there were at least 3 demonstrations that Friends of the Earth people took part in. So we had 50 activists from Scotland who went and took part. And the first thing they did was to collect in groups, go and be briefed in various spots around the city, go and stand on a street corner and access an app on their mobile phone which geotagged them on a map of Paris. So between them, about 6,000 people spelt out the words climate, justice, peace across Paris. And I was sitting inside the negotiations watching these terribly boring speeches and backwards and forwards about single words that should be in or out, and then hours when something was supposed to be happening but nothing was happening. And I was watching this map assembling itself. So you'd get little green dots appear, and over time, over about an hour, the words climate, justice, peace appeared on this map of Paris. And each of those dots was a group of people standing with a mobile phone just in the right place. And that was really impressive. The fact that 2 weeks before, everything was off, suddenly all the plans that had been made for many, many months couldn't happen, and nobody knew what to do. And within 2 weeks, they'd come up with this new innovation, this idea of a geomapping, spelling words out across the city. So that was great. That was followed by a big demonstration called the Red Lines, where there were tens of thousands of people, another gathering with speeches at the Eiffel Tower. So there were actually some quite big gatherings, despite the message that no one should come. And do those things make a difference? Well, certainly, I always think these things probably make a difference next time. So if you think of the big anti-war march in London when 1 million people marched and 100,000 people were outside this building, that didn't stop the Iraq war, but it probably stopped us going into Iran or Syria or somewhere else, because politicians couldn't quite halt the momentum of where they'd got to, couldn't roll back on that rhetoric, but the next set of politicians knew how unpopular the same kind of thing would be again. So it always seems to me you're investing in the next one, even though you're shouting about the current one. And that was kind of true in Copenhagen. So there were 100,000 people on the streets of Copenhagen in 2009 for the big climate conference then. And that kind of pressure meant that when world leaders turned up on the Sunday night of the beginning of the second week and found that nothing at all had been achieved in the first week, there was nothing for them to sign, and they'd have to pluck something out of thin air, those 100,000 people made them feel that pressure that they needed to produce something. So what they produced wasn't particularly good, but they produced something. There's a great story about the whole conference centre was emptied of NGO people, but there are a few who stayed in the toilets, and they would wander about and see various things going on. And one of the things they did was walk past a room and look in the door, and there was Obama and a few other world leaders sitting around President Medvedev of Russia as he typed on his laptop the Copenhagen Accord. which they signed at the end of the time. So it was that desperate that nothing had been done, and world leaders really did make this thing up. And that's because 100,000 people were out there, and the world's media were saying there's lots of pressure, something should happen. And we had that again in September. We had 400,000 people marching on the streets of New York. And again, Obama was feeling that pressure that he had to come to Paris and to do something, say the right words, and get something done. So whilst they haven't done what we want, they've done something because that people pressure is there. But just finally, the really important point about Paris was that whilst inside there was the same kind of thing as Copenhagen, there was a deal being struck which was not going to be good enough. On the outside, everyone, certainly in the last weekend, everyone who was there was talking about the inside just being a step on the way, and the important thing is those people continuing to be a movement. So there's now a much stronger global climate movement of people who are going to oppose fossil fuels, who are going to work on divestment of money, pension funds, etc., out of fossil fuels, on positive things like renewable energy. So we went to Copenhagen thinking the world leaders are going to save us, that's great, and that was really depressing when they didn't. We went to Paris thinking, well, they're going to do something, but we know already it's not going to be good enough. We are going to make up for their deficiencies. So people power actually had a real boost in Paris, even though what was done on the inside wasn't good enough, despite what they claim. Actually, lots of movements have been strengthened and created as a result of that. So I have a lot of hope about what difference people power will make on climate change because of what was outside the conference centre, not what was inside.
Excellent. On that really positive note, and surprisingly positive actually, I thought we could open it up for some questions. We've got some microphones here, so if you have a question, put your hand up. If you could tell us who you are and if your question is aimed at a particular person, let us know. That would be great. There's a lady here.
Hello, I'm Lucy. I work for the Trussell Trust, but this is not a question in relation to that. I'm wondering whether the panel think that there's a chronic problem with the mainstream media underreporting or lying about the number of people who turn up to protests. Because I remember being in Copenhagen and marching too in 2009, and I remember the mainstream media completely lying about how many people were there, and we were physically there watching this going, how can this not be accurately reported? Thanks.
I think that's a great question for Murray. Do you lie about the number of people that turn up for demonstrations?
I wouldn't say that the Daily Record would, because we're quite in favour of most of the sort of grassroots movements, but I think there's some of the right-wing colleagues in the press would be less than honest. I think the difficulty is properly estimating the number of people. We tend to take, our guide is we go to the police generally, we ask the police, how many people do you estimate were there? And we tend to take their view. And if they say 5,000, well, who are we to argue? It is difficult to estimate. But I've certainly never said actually round that down at any point. But that's not to say that other colleagues in the press have done that.
Are you impressed by a demonstration though, from your news values? If somebody comes to you and says there was 5,000 people out in the streets of Glasgow,
I don't think that a million people marching against the war can be ignored by anyone. And the reality is politicians don't like being unpopular. And if 11 million people are telling them something, they're going to listen. It's as simple as that. So yes, scale does matter. If there's two guys standing with a dog shouting at you, you can walk past them and there's no problem. If there's 5,000 people there, you are going to be swayed by it. There's no two ways about it. Well, I'm afraid the issue then is with the police. Well, I'm not sure that my journalists' best use of their time is to count 2,000 or 5,000 people standing outside a building. Well, how do you estimate? I don't know the size of crowds when I see them. I go to football matches and it says there's 28,000 people in the ground, and then you hear that there's only 12. It's difficult. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but I have not at any point suggested that we round down, ever.
Yeah. Richard?
There's a rule of thumb in the environment and peace protest movement, which is when the police tell you how many people were there, you double it, and that's the right number. And it's really very accurate. The big climate march in Edinburgh at the end of November in terrible weather, police said 3,500, and I counted them when they were at the Ross Bandstand and there were 7,000. So it really is very accurate. You just double the number the police tell you.
And I'd gone for tea and cake by that point.
That's right. Indeed, so it's 7,001. But in one sense, that's just a running joke and we all laugh about it. But actually, that's the figure that gets in the media, and so that is a deliberate establishment thing to underplay every demonstration that ever happens. So we kind of joke about it, but actually it's a really systematic, unpleasant thing that's been going on for at least 20 years.
Stuart?
I mean, I think there's strategies you can adopt to get around it, and that's make sure that you've got really attractive images that you have on social media, because increasingly traditional media follows what's on social media, and if there's a ton of pictures looking like, wow, there's an awful lot of people doing something, then you have a chance to seize the news agenda yourself. And if you provide them with, hey, here's a great picture of lots of people, in some ways it doesn't matter if the police say whether it's 5,000 or 10,000, it looks like a lot. So think in terms not of raw numbers, but think in terms of how dramatic and impactful can you make this for the people you're trying to reach on social media, and then I bet you'll find mainstream media will follow along, though maybe not the Daily Mail.
Kat, did you get much coverage of your demonstration was it in George Square?
Yep.
Yep.
We got great coverage of it was the demonstration against Rush V. Although, I mean, I say it's against Rush V, that man was just a symbol of like the ongoing culture of misogyny, of rape culture, and there was a really, really good showing on a Saturday night of about 500 people, and it was great. It was actually really well covered. Generally, I know that the press usually take the police's estimates on this. Like, having been on the radical left for quite a long time, we do the same thing. Take the police number and double it. Sometimes add half as well. But yeah, I think that, like, whilst I agree that numbers in protests do matter, like, well, some people can ignore them. I mean, Tony Blair ignored the millions of people that marched against the war in Iraq at the end of the day, but that protest continued, and I think that the Stop the War movement did stop the first interventions into Syria. I think that the Stop the War movement basically like ruined Tony Blair's career, and rightly so. I think that it continued a narrative about you know, peace and justice and what it means to be a war criminal. Whilst those numbers were massive and they were able to be ignored, small protests work as well. And it's about like how effective those protests are. And I think that there are groups springing up just now that have new, inventive and quite exciting ways of getting their message across. One of the examples is a campaign called Better Than Zero. It's led by young precarious workers, and in most of their stunts there might be about 20 of them, but the stunts are always in really, really good humour. They're currently targeting the G1 group, who are run by Stefan King, quite a notorious bad employer who runs bars, clubs and restaurants across Glasgow, across Scotland, but a lot of them are concentrated in Glasgow, and they were found out recently for undercutting the minimum wage. So this group of young workers have got together and decided to basically just embarrass him wherever he goes. And the last stunt that they did, there was like, yeah, about 15 or 20 of them, but they went around G1 venues with white like hazard suits on, black and yellow striped tape, and taped off the entrances and started stickering with like health and safety warnings saying, danger, do not enter, risk of exploitation. And like, it got loads of great coverage. You know, we've done like an occupation in Ashton Lane where there's loads of G1 venues down there, had loads of support from the other businesses there that are actually not G1. So it doesn't matter the numbers. Like, if you can like tap into a creative type of protest culture, then you can really, really get your message across without having millions on the street. I mean, obviously 0 hours, 0 rights and 0 respect jobs affect everybody. Like, nearly all of my friends are trapped in that kind of labour market. But you know, when they see other young people out fighting it on social media, then it gives them a boost as well. They might not be there, but they'll share it, they'll tell their friends about it, and it starts to catch on, it starts to go viral. And I think that's as important as anything in terms of numbers.
Absolutely. Creativity is key when it comes to campaigning. Any more questions?
Hi, it's Michael Gray from Common Space, which is a news group online. there's often a lot of discussion in Scotland about progressive values and how Scotland's a progressive beacon. That being the case, why do the panel think there are so few concrete examples of devolved policy making that has redistributed either power or wealth in the last 17 years?
Difficult one. Who wants to start with that? Stewart?
Thanks. Oh dear. Can we talk about Snapchat again? Okay, I think, here we go. Devolution is a process, not an event, and we are still in the very early days of of how we manage government through a devolved system. But that's that may sound a bit waffly, but it is actually the case. We're still getting understanding what the DNA is of a devolved Scotland. I would like to see much more in the way of redistributive and social justice policies from the Scottish Government. I think one of the things that I've been very heartened by is something that's close to my heart, is actually on land reform, where they have actually moved from a position that was, charitably characterisable as dishwater to something that is a bloody good start. That's not redistributive, but it does introduce an element of social justice in our land laws that's moved them from, say, the late 16th century to something more appropriate to where we are now. I hope, personally, that that's the start of more of a journey for the Scottish Government, the Scottish National Party and government. I await with interest what we see after the May election.
Kat, do you think you're going to get elected?
That's a really brutal question to ask. Do you know what, right? I was a teenage goth, right? So I'm not used to being particularly optimistic about the world. I'm also a socialist and feminist in the west of Scotland, so I'm not really used to winning anything ever. So if I do get elected, then it would be pretty spectacular. I guess the point is that it's not impossible. It's not impossible to get radical left-wing voices in the Parliament. In fact, it's happened before. We had the SSP with a great success, over a decade ago now, but it's not impossible that those ideas have real traction in Scottish society, and I think we need them now more than ever. I think part of the problem is that generally the politics of devolution have been centrist, and when there haven't been radical voices in the Parliament to be able to argue for redistribution of wealth and power, then it's caused a kind of comfortableness where politics becomes about petty point scoring between two parties who tribally hate each other. I mean, and that's a shame, but that's why this election is really, really important, because we need some of the, whilst they're not redistributive policies, some of the SNP's best and most progressive ideas came from the Scottish Socialist Party. Free bus travel, free prescriptions, free school meals. Those radical ideas needed a platform in the Parliament in the first place in order that they could then catch on. And some of the ideas that we are talking about in Rise, which includes the Scottish Socialist Party, of course, are about saying that if we want to have decent public services, if we want to actually be able to lift children out of poverty, then the rich need to pay their share. The rich and people with high incomes need to pay more in tax. I'm looking forward to a discussion about council tax reform, because the way it's set up just now is just completely unfair, and it needs to move to something that's actually making sure that the people who have the most, who can contribute the most, do contribute the most. So I might not get elected, but it doesn't mean that we're going to stop campaigning for redistribution of wealth and power. It's the only thing that's going to make Scotland better.
I think that's the first time I've ever heard anyone say I'm looking forward to a discussion about council tax reform.
I love council tax, mate.
I'm Sheila Young, I'm Director of Home Start in Scotland. We work with a lot of poor families, and I would be the second person, Murray, to say I'm looking forward to a debate about local taxation, if not council tax, because it's incredibly important, and thank you, Kat, for making that point. I want to go back a little bit about that subject about the wealth gap. If we're talking about people, power and politics and what makes a difference, you're a feminist, Kat. I'm a feminist. I'm a bit older than you. Back in the day, even before my time, one of the ways in which women joined that struggle to have equal rights, which we still don't have in terms of the gender pay gap and so forth, was we had to raise each other's consciousness. We had to make women feel that they had the right to campaign and have a voice. And I think, very unfortunately, when we talk about wider denial of rights, and we talk about poverty, whether it's global, I used to work for Oxfam, but probably when it's more local, what we're doing is systematically stripping people of the sense that they have the right to a better life, and that concerns me. And that is an issue about the way the discourse around poverty is played out in the media in other places. The notion that someone who doesn't do well enough is somehow responsible for that, and it's become an individual problem. We have an economy structured around the need to keep some people poor. That's what we've got now. And for an individual to exercise their people power, to be confident and brave enough to join with other people and say this is not good enough, is a big ask when they're told continually that they should be striving to do better. And this brings this meeting today right through to full circle with Shami Chakrabarty's talk about economic and social rights this morning and human rights. We have to start using a rights-based agenda to raise people's confidence and awareness that they can have a voice and they can get together and they can say these things. Because it's almost like we've moved further away from that in my lifetime, not closer, which disturbs me. So my question really is, and you're going to move me to that, sorry, bit of a speech. So my question is, what do you think, anybody in the panel, we can do to move to a situation where people have the confidence again to say this is not good enough, we demand better?
I think the obvious person to answer that question is Kat, but I also think that the growth of digital petition and digital campaigning perhaps gives people an opportunity that they didn't have before. So maybe Stewart, you can say something.
I think the great lie that power elites, like the rest of us, believe is that we don't have any power. We do. You know, when we come together and we speak together, we have an enormous amount of power. The mission of 38 Degrees is not to create large petitions. The mission of 38 Degrees is to make people feel their power and feel that they have a voice and make sure that they are listened to. And the reason there's a staff team of whom I'm a member is that we provide full-time support to people campaigning. So we're not change.com, we're not a petition site, we're the start of a campaign. And so people sign a petition, we then encourage them to take other actions, we encourage them to come together with other people, we encourage them to meet their MSP, to email their MSP, we encourage them to take part in demonstrations, events, petition hand-ins, contact the media, But at every step of the way, we want people to feel that they are backed up and they're not alone. So I'm going to mention Mags Higgins. Hi, Mags. Because Mags is the guardian at the moment of a great petition that we've got going to get Glasgow City Council, perhaps not the greatest bastion of openness in the history of democracy, to open up buildings to homeless people. Now, Mags has got, is it 10,000 people have signed that petition? Just under 11,000 people have signed that petition. Mags is having a devil of a job getting anyone at Glasgow City Council to listen to her. So part of my job is to bring, well, I would never describe it as the pain hammer, but to bring an increased level of engagement to those 11,000 people's engagement with Glasgow City Council, because it's just not acceptable for a supposedly democratic elected body to ignore 11,000 people within its area. Those people are voters, those people are citizens, those people are council taxpayers. They should be listened to. So Mags has done a great job gathering that, and my job is to support her. And that's people just standing up and saying, I'm not going to put up with this, I'm going to do something about it. So to get our voices heard, you're right, the great moment of courage is to be the first person to speak out, but then the rest of us have to stand up and speak out too.
And Richard, Friends of the Earth, you have a lot of local groups, campaigning groups. Do you provide support and guidance to them on running campaigns? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have 10 local groups around Scotland, and they can campaign on anything they like, as long as it's not pro-nuclear, for instance. So as long as it's kind of within our remit, they choose what they want to do. So one of them has a community garden where they help people grow food. Another does cycle campaigning. Another does a big campaign against fracking. So up to them, we try and support them both in terms of the issue itself and in terms of tactics and techniques and resources. I think there's an interesting dynamic within the SNP. So we saw at the autumn conference that fracking was on the agenda, and the leadership really didn't want it to be there, so it was the most watered down possible version, saying please do something, which they'd done last week. And the mood of the room was very clearly to say we don't want fracking at all, and they'd kind of arranged it so that that wasn't the message that emerged in the media, but that was indeed the message. So the SNP are very interesting because they've got these 100,000 new members, all activated by the independence referendum, actually for the first time in their lives perhaps believing that politics can make a difference and they should get engaged. And the SNP don't really understand them very well. They're probably more left than the average SNP member. And so the SNP is being pulled in a certain direction, but doesn't quite know how to do that. We've got the spring conference coming up next month, and again, they've kept fracking off the agenda because they don't want any little mishaps. But those members are not going to be very happy about that. In fact, that'll be here in mid-March. And if I was talking about the election and parties, of course, I would have to think about whether my organisation was going to register as a party, in a non-party active organisation in the election, and I'd have to think about, therefore, how much money did I spend to come here and how much staff time did I spend talking about the election. So the UK government, for all of us, has put this incredible hurdle in our way for engaging in the political process. So I would like to have on my website something very nice, ranking the manifestos, saying who's got the most environmentally friendly manifesto of all the parties standing. And if I did that, I would start to get in trouble with election law, but I would certainly get in trouble with the amount of money that I might be spending and having to account for all of that, and whether I was registered or not, and whether what I was promoting was party political, because clearly I'd be saying someone was better than someone else, and also how exactly that furthered my charity's charitable aims. So I'd start get into that discussion. So for all of us, that's a real problem, and it's done exactly what the Tory government wanted it to do, which is to make us all think, oh, perhaps I'd better not say anything about the election because I might get in trouble. So it's a real barrier to ordinary people and charities' participation, is this idea that suddenly you can't say anything political in an election period, which of course previously we could. And Stewart, I'm sure, has had to think how, because 38 degrees is certainly going to be working on the election, but has no doubt had to think about these spending limits and how that works, and not spending more than £1,000 in one constituency and all those kind of things. So
sorry, I was going to say, back to Sheila, I was going to move it on to Murray, sorry. Back to Sheila's question, I was just wondering how much you're interested in hearing radical voices in the Daily Record, and how much the media is interested in hearing radical voices.
The Daily Record is mainstream. There's no two ways about it. We have a certain readership that expects certain things of the paper. And if you're too radical, they switch off. And I have to accept that it's a commercial venture that I happen to be the editor of for a period of time, maybe not all that long. But I'm currently in charge of the Daily Record and I make decisions. It does bother me that I can't find a way that shakes people out of their sleep. There's stuff that happens in this country that I find myself pulling my hair, stomping around the living room at night saying, why don't people waking up and see the problems here? And in a small way, we'll put stories in. We hammered the bedroom tax stories, case study after case study after case study. Eventually, again, it goes back to I'm not saying that Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want to eradicate poverty. I'm sure she does, but she does have other elements that she needs to govern on as well. But eventually, they moved to ameliorate the effect of the bedroom tax in this country, which is a great result, absolutely brilliant. We're currently going through a process of austerity from Westminster, and we ran a story last week about a young man who had mental health illnesses, mental health problems, and he was more or less hounded to take his own life by benefit agencies chasing him, cutting off his income, etc. Now, I ran that on the front page. I knew full well that it wouldn't sell as many copies as something a bit more tabloidy, but I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do. But I also have to be mindful that I can't do it constantly, or I'll just turn people off and they'll not buy the paper. So if there's a panacea, if anyone knows how to waken people up, please, answers on a postcard.
Okay, I'm just going to finish up with one last question from me for you all, because we've only got a couple more minutes left. The Westminster government, this sort of picks up on some of the things you were saying, Richard, about the lobbying bill. The Westminster government has now announced that government grants will have clauses, government grants to charities will have a clause saying that the money they receive from the government cannot be used for campaigning. Nicola Sturgeon just this morning told the people in this room that that would not be happening with Scottish Government grants. How do you feel about that? Should government funding ever be used to campaign against the government? Murray, do you want to
Yes. Absolutely. It's outrageous to suggest that it shouldn't be. If the government are doing something wrong, they should be told they're wrong. Simple as that.
Cap?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that it's a shameful move. I mean, and it ties into what we were talking about at the last discussion about you know, how do you empower people? And I wrote an article a while ago, and it's something that totally stuck with me. It was based on a news report from the Clydebank Post, and it was about a woman who basically, after she'd paid her TV licence and her bills, she was left with £3 to live on. She basically was starving herself to feed her kids in modern Scotland. And it's the question I can't get over is, how many acts of political indifference does it take to let that happen? And there's other reports that come out that talk about 2/3 of people in Scotland are lonely. Like, people talking about loneliness, and it's not the sort of stereotypical picture of loneliness that you might have in a sort of cartoony way, where I think about like an old woman with lots of cats and things like that. It's young people. It's young people who feel lonely, feel completely isolated from their communities, and that's because there is a serious issue of shame and stigma around poverty. Now, the charities that we have are not a sticking plaster for Tory austerity. They're about advocacy and empowerment, and that's what charity is about. And as soon as you, under this sort of dark landscape of Tory austerity, start to empower people and be an advocacy service and give people back a little bit of dignity, then that's going to come into contradiction with the Tory government, and rightly so.
When I started at Friends of the Earth in 1994, I came across some European grants that Friends of the Earth had across Europe. And in those days, the European Union was delighted to pay people to slag them off. I was really surprised by that, but then I thought about it, and I thought, well, actually, that's how policy changes. That's really important. And they don't really do it anymore. It's much harder to get European money, and even if you do, they don't like to slag them off very much. But let's think how policy changes. If you're the Trestle Trust, who knows better than you about the impact of austerity on people in relation to food? Nobody. So you're the people who should be coming up with solutions. You're the people who should be asking government to do something about it. But if they're not listening, you're the people who should be shouting at government. So, of course, if you've got government money to be the expert at delivering something, then you're the ideal people to be telling government how to fix the problem.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think 38 Degrees take government money, do you?
We are in the very, very fortunate position of being solely funded by member donations. So, unlike the electoral legislation that Richard was describing, we'll miss out on being hit by this one, which is great because the government needs criticised. That's democracy, and any statement that begins, the government wants you to stop criticising them because does not need to be finished, it's just wrong. The government should be held to scrutiny. As Richard said, a lot of charities who receive government grants happen to be experts in the areas that they cover, and they have a lot to bring to the table, and they should be allowed to do it publicly, just as corporate lobbyists are allowed to influence government policy. So should charities who are experts in an area be allowed to counter that.
Thank you very much. So I think that's all we've got time for, so thank you very much to all of you. That was really fascinating, lots of interesting insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.